roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
O Hospital Royal Bethlehem de Londres foi uma das primeiras instituições psiquiátricas do mundo. Conhecido como Bedlam, o hospital não era mais do que um armazém para aqueles considerados loucos. Os internados eram encarcerados em jaulas, despensas e estábulos, eram acorrentados à parede e eram chicoteados, enquanto o hospital cobrava a admissão para a exibição pública. No século XVIII, William Batty foi o primeiro a promover que os seus hospitais podiam curar os doentes mentais. Os manicômios de Batty tornaram-no o homem mais rico da Inglaterra, ainda que os seus tratamentos fossem tão desumanos como os praticados em Bedlam, sem um único paciente curado. O seu êxito financeiro desencadeou uma expansão no negócio dos manicômios e a oportunidade para os psiquiatras lucrarem com esta nova indústria crescente.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
Mas enquanto aqueles que dirigiam as instituições enriqueciam, faltava aos psiquiatras a credibilidade para maximizar as suas receitas.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Os psiquiatras procuraram depois dar crédito às suas práticas ao disfarçá-las na linguagem da medicina. Este redesenho do tratamento tornou-se conhecido como modelo médico.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Ao levar mais adiante a teoria biológica da doença mental, um americano, Benjamin Rush, propôs a ideia de que a loucura era causada devido a um grande volume de sangue na cabeça. A cura? Tirar o sangue por qualquer meio. Imobilização, água gelada, sangramento, inclusive o terror. E com isso, criou-se um novo modelo médico.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Os procedimentos frequentemente letais de Rush foram detalhados no seu livro de 1812, que continuou a ser a fonte autorizada da psiquiatria durante os próximos 70 anos. Ele era tão reverenciado que em 1965 Rush foi consagrado pai da psiquiatria americana no selo da Associação Psiquiátrica Americana. Nos finais do século XIX, os crescentes fracassos da psiquiatria em curar a loucura ameaçavam os seus lucros financeiros, obrigando-os a inventar novos modelos médicos.
The cures promised when it was delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
O século XX trouxe mais modelos médicos. O psiquiatra americano Henry Cotton mutilava os seus pacientes, removendo-lhes partes do corpo, e declarou que este era um grande avanço para tratar as doenças mentais.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses. But when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
Com a escalada da indignação pública pela tortura e mutilação de pacientes, os psiquiatras inventaram novos métodos, cada um aclamado como cura milagrosa. Mas cada um provou ser tão ineficaz e brutal como o anterior.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
Ao avançar no século XX, a psiquiatria continuou a procurar a legitimidade ao transformar-se em disciplina médica. Mas somente conseguiram criar formas mais eficientes de infligir tortura mental e física e morte. Um legado que tem continuado até à psiquiatria moderna com o seu mais lucrativo modelo médico até hoje. Drogar milhões de pessoas. Mas para o conseguir, os psiquiatras primeiro tinham de destroçar uma das crenças mais preciosas da humanidade, decretando que as pessoas não eram o que pensavam que eram.